The grand war chamber of the ascended empire was built to humble lesser species, a cathedral of conquest, black basalt floors polished to mirror finish, vast pillars carved from the bones of extinct leviathans, and a ceiling alive with light from a captive star bound in a lattice of plasma restraints. The air itself felt judgmental, sterile, metallic, and perfumed with incense brewed from dissolved meteor dust. Upon the raised dais sat Emperor Verox, the unifier of 12,000 worlds, his golden armor etched with the screams of conquered languages. Crimson banners hung behind him, each a chronicle of extinguished civilizations. The man himself, if he could be called such, stood twice the height of a human, broad as a siege tank, his every movement accompanied by the soft chime of servos and ceremonial rings that orbitally floated behind his crown like a halo forged of gravitic light. Around him, 1,000 dignitaries from vassal worlds waited in reverent stillness. They came in every conceivable form, insectoid shells glinting under the false star, beings of vapor flickering in containment fields, scaled creatures whose slit-pupiled eyes never blinked. All were united in a single, suffocating truth, submission to the ascended throne. A vibration of horns began the ritual, the declaration. Verox rose. His voice, amplified by the throne's resonance systems, rolled through the chamber like a tectonic upheaval. By decree of the imperial harmony, humanity stands condemned for defiance. They reject unity. They sow chaos. They cling to their entropy as though it were virtue. Each sentence landed like a meteor strike. With each pronouncement, priests of the doctrine struck gongs forged from the ruins of defeated capitals. For the sin of rebellion, for the crime of discord, for the heresy of individuality, humanity shall be erased, not conquered, but annihilated. Their ashes will be an offering to order. The chamber bowed as one, heads lowered, arms crossed in reverence. Even the light dimmed at the edges, as though afraid to challenge the emperor's gravity. All except one man. At the central table, a polished slab of reflective obsidian, sat Robert Derringer, humanity's sole representative. He did not kneel. Instead, the man slouched, his jacket wrinkled, tie askew, posture disinterested. His face carried the weary expression of someone who had long ago run out of patience for ceremony. When Verox finished speaking, the silence that followed was absolute, sacred. Then came a sound no one in the chamber had ever heard in such a place, the loud, crude scrape of a chair. Derringer leaned back, reached into his coat, and pulled out a crumpled pack of red death cigarettes, an archaic, toxic human vice banned in half the civilized galaxy. He tapped one out, placed it between his lips, and flicked open a battered brass lighter that clicked like a gun being cocked. The flame reflected in his eyes, tired, sharp, and unamused. A gasp rippled through the assembly. Even Verox paused. An imperial guard, more machine than flesh, moved forward, halberd sparking with plasma, intent on striking down this insolence. But before he could act, a tall, spindly alien dignitary, all ivory limbs and translucent skin, raised a skeletal hand and hissed in the high ascendant tongue, an ancient dialect reserved for emperors and saints. Do not desecrate the right, warrior. Let the condemned speak before the fall. Derringer exhaled smoke through his nose and, without even looking at the creature, replied in that same ancient, impossibly complex dialect, flawlessly. Patience, he said, tone surgical, is a virtue, even when your master lacks it. The effect was seismic. The chamber erupted into whispers and subharmonic murmurs. The dignitaries exchanged shocked gestures. Even Verox's eyes narrowed. The high ascendant tongue was dead, lost of millennia except to imperial scholars and ritual reciters. For this primitive mammal to speak it with fluency was no coincidence. It was an insult, a declaration of cultural war. At Verox's side, Grand Marshal Corliss quietly accessed his wrist console. Lines of data flickered. Robert Derringer, former xenoanthropologist, Terran University of New Geneva. Specialty: obsolete imperial dialects and proto-ritual semantics. Corralis's jaw tightened. The human had come prepared to offend by design. Derringer took one last drag, flicked the cigarette butt onto the perfect obsidian table, and crushed it out with the heel of his palm, leaving a black smear. Then he stood, straightened his wrinkled coat, and muttered, "Your funeral." And just like that, he walked out, leaving behind the lingering stench of burning tobacco and humiliation. The ritual had been shattered. The Empire's godlike aura cracked in front of 1,000 witnesses. Days later, aboard the Imperial flagship Unquestionable Mandate, the fleet moved through Jupiter orbit, a cathedral armada of silver spears and golden crescents. At its center, the Mandate loomed like a city of light, a kilometer-long fortress, its weapons enough to sterilize continents. Grand Marshal Corley stood at the command balcony, eyes fixed on holographic projections of a human defense. What he saw made no sense. There were no battle formations, no fleets worthy of the term, just asteroid miners, orbital tugs, bulk freighters welded with missile racks. A collection of junk. Begin standard wedge advance, he ordered. They'll die swiftly. His officers obeyed. The Imperial phalanx surged forward, elegant, disciplined, predictable. Then everything went wrong. Human ships didn't meet them head-on. They scattered. Some disappeared behind moons. Others dove into the chaos of asteroid belts. A few used Jupiter's gravity to slingshot into absurd trajectories. The Imperial computers faltered, unable to track the irrationality of human maneuvers. And then one of the haulers, a mining ship called Rock Chewer, overloaded its reactor, vending plasma directly into the path of an advancing battlecruiser. The detonation engulfed both vessels in a fireball so intense it shorted the Mandate sensors. On the Imperial Comnet, confusion reigned. Enemy ship destroyed, but reactor? They're jamming comms with music? What kind of is that a child singing? The flagship screens erupted with memes, propaganda loops, and absurd images. Deepfakes of Emperor Verox hawking discount starships. Animated cartoons of ascended soldiers tripping over their own armor. A chorus of children singing in English. We're not scared of gods, we make our own. Corley stared in disbelief. This is madness. His adjutant whispered, trembling, They're weaponizing humor, my lord. He could only murmur, against doctrine, against reason itself. The Imperial War became a farce, and in that absurdity, humanity found power. Mars, Mariner Valley. The Empire's ground forces landed in disciplined waves. Silver ranks of ascended legions and hulking Draxorian shock troops marched under the banners of conquest. Olympus Village lay ahead, the first human settlement marked for eradication. But the valley was a trap. The first explosions came from the cliffs. Controlled landslides buried entire platoons. The red dust turned opaque with chaos. Then came the IEDs, chemical bombs that liquefied armor plating into molten slag. The advance turned into a nightmare of confusion. Draxorian Sergeant Harbinger, a towering reptilian warrior, crawled out of a crater, his squad shredded. His scaled hide was burned and smoking, his plasma rifle half-melted. Around him, humans attacked not with glory, but with trickery, hit-and-run ambushes, laughing voices over comms, holograms that flickered with phantom targets. When Harbinger finally reached an aid cave, he found wounded of both species. He saw an ascended officer step over a dying Draxorian without pause, spitting the word expendable. Harbinger's claws tightened. He knelt beside a wounded youth, human, the boy barely breathing, eyes wide with fear. Without thinking, Harbinger removed his helmet and shared his water with the dying soldier. The human's lips trembled. Thanks. And in that moment, amid the red dust and burning metal, something shifted in Harbinger's heart. He no longer saw enemies. He saw kindred beings, defying the same empire that had used his people as cannon fodder for centuries. His loyalty cracked. His silence became rebellion seed. The Imperial fleet advanced through the solar system like an unstoppable tide, or so its architect had decreed. The doctrine was older than most of its captains. Order triumphs through precision. Victory is the perfection of predictability. But perfection died the moment it met humanity. Grand Marshal Corley stood on the bridge of the Unquestionable Mandate, watching his tactical displays disintegrate into chaos. Human vessels darted across his holographic projection like fireflies in a storm, erratic, ungridded, wrong. Recalibrate tracking algorithms, he ordered, his voice clipped, his tone controlled through sheer will. Already attempting, Marshal, replied a tech officer, tendrils flickering over hollow consoles. But they're not maintaining velocity vectors. They're changing course mid-burn. Impossible, Corley's hissed. No living pilot. They're not pilots, sir, the officer said, voice trembling. They're autopilot demons. Civilian code. The feed zoomed in on a cluster of human ships. Tugboats, refineries, asteroid miners, darting to the dense chaos of the belt between Mars and Jupiter. They used debris clouds, comet tails, even Jupiter's radiation fields as cover. Ships vanished and reappeared in gravitational eddies, as though the solar system itself were conspiring to hide them. Every Imperial simulation assumed order. Humans gave them entropy. Corley's clenched his jaw. Maintain formation. They'll scatter themselves to death. But then, a proximity alert blared. A mining vessel. ID code Rock Chewer lurched out from the shadow of a moon fragment. Its reactor core burned far hotter than it should. Marshal, it's overloading. Before Corley's could speak, Rock Chewer vented its reactor straight into the path of the cruiser Exalted Flame. The explosion was instantaneous and obscene, a sunburst of plasma that consumed both vessels and scattered molten debris across the formation. The mandate shuddered. The lights flickered. Report. Direct hit on the Exalted Flame. 8,000 dead. Caused deliberate reactor breach. Corley's turned slowly toward the viewport. They killed themselves. Yes, Marshal. He exhaled not admiration, but dread. They weaponized madness. And as if the universe wished to prove his point, the entire Imperial communication grid erupted in noise. Transmission override detected. The Emperor's face filled every screen, but it wasn't Verox. It was a grotesque deepfake of him selling discount starships, his golden visage re-rendered with cheap sunglasses and a salesman's grin. A high-pitched human song followed, absurdly childish, endlessly repetitive. Baby Shark, do-do-do-do-do-do. It played across every frequency, in the battle net, in navigation relays, even in the bridge's encrypted channels. Officers screamed for silence. Comms officers tore out head jacks. Someone sobbed. The entire Imperial fleet, billions of tons of order and discipline, was undone by a nursery rhyme. Corley stood amid the cacophony, jaw rigid, realizing the truth. They weren't fighting soldiers. They were fighting tricksters. And tricksters made mockery of gods. Mars, Mariner Valley. The ascended legions had expected glory. Instead, they found gravity and grit. Columns of silver-armored troops and Draxorian shock units marched into the canyon of Mariner Valley, banners high. The air was thin, the horizon dust-red, but the mood was resolute. The first explosions came at midday. Timed charges hidden in the canyon walls triggered avalanches that buried squads alive. Then the ground turned against them. Resonance devices hidden beneath rock layers pulsed with sonic waves, turning the bedrock into liquid slurry. Ascended troopers screamed as their boots sank, armor dragging them down. From the cliffs, rail rifles sang. Snipers picked off anyone who slipped. And then came the polymer gel, transparent, slippery as ice, coating every flat surface. Marching lines became slapstick carnage. Draxorians stumbled into pits. Ascended officers fell face first in the muck, and all the while, distant human laughter echoed through comms frequencies. Sergeant Harbinger emerged from a blast crater, his armor cracked, his weapon overheating. Half his squad had sunk into a mud pool that boiled from a hidden chemical charge. The survivors screamed until the steam swallowed them. By nightfall, the canyon fell silent except for the wind. In a makeshift cave aid station, Harbinger crouched beside a wounded Draxorian youth. His scales blackened. The boy's breathing was shallow. Harbinger opened his canteen and offered water, a sacred ration, but an ascended officer's voice cut through the dim light. Waste not Imperial resources on assets, Sergeant. Harbinger's eyes lifted slowly, glowing with quiet fury. He tilted the canteen anyway, letting the boy drink. Then I'll waste mine. The officer said nothing. He didn't have to. Harbinger had already chosen his side. Kuiper Belt, Asteroid Workshop Theta, 9. In a cramped, freezing workshop built for mining scrap, Robert Derringer hunched over a hollow table beside a young engineer named Sal, whose cybernetic arm flickered with a blue diagnostic glow. The walls hummed with overworked reactors. Outside, the stars were sharp as needles. Sal gestured at a projection of drones swarming around a cruiser. We hijacked Crop Duster AI. It avoids birds using adaptive chaos math. Now it's avoiding plasma bolts the same way. Derringer laughed, tired but impressed. You turned farm equipment into missile defense. Hey, food or freedom? Same difference, Sal said, grinning. Derringer pulled a flask from his coat, took a long drink, and passed it over. They expect chess. Let's flip the table and hit him with a chair. The engineers laughed, but there was exhaustion under it. Derringer looked around at them. Kids in patch pressure suits, welding humanity's survival together one insane idea at a time. You're all brilliant, he muttered. I just wish you'd been born in a world that didn't need you to be. Outer system, Comet Server Farm E9. On a drifting ice comet, Hacker Evie sat cocooned in a blanket of fiber cables. Her fingers danced over hollow screens as frozen vapor haloed her breath. Uploading payload, she whispered. Her code moved through the Empire's networks disguised as a harmless firmware update. But once inside, it bloomed like wildfire, not destruction, but revelation. Screens across the galaxy lit up with raw footage. Marines charging trenches with knives. A pilot ramming a destroyer while broadcasting. For the music. A platoon standing their ground under bombardment, while Beethoven's ode to joy thundered behind them. Then Wagner. Then Holst. Humanity's last stand set to its oldest symphonies. Evie didn't caption it. She didn't need to. The images spoke to something even vassals could feel, defiance that didn't serve a throne. Talsetti Garrison, Draxorian Barracks. Harbinger sat in a dim barracks among fellow soldiers, the air thick with oil and regret. Someone had smuggled in the human footage. It played on a stolen projector, flickering across tired faces. They watched humans die, but together, no one abandoned the fallen. No one stood above another. One Draxorian growled, voice low and angry. They die for each other. Why do we die for their masters? Harbinger said nothing. He didn't have to. His silence was enough. Something irreversible had begun. Ordinatus Prime, Imperial Bureaucratic Nexus. Deep within the vaults of the throne world, Scribe Foritus 7, a pale, multi-limbed archivist, noticed the numbers shifting. Supplies vanishing into statistical fog. Fleets waiting for requisitions that would never come. Human irrationality had polluted the logistics like a virus. Foritus tilted his head, curious. If chaos breaks the system, perhaps the system can feed upon itself. He began invoking obscure compliance codes, invoking cross-departmental quarantine rules, redundant security verifications. Entire resupply chains froze overnight under the weight of perfect obedience. His superiors called it loyalty. He called it malicious compliance. The Empire's greatest weapon, bureaucracy, was now its parasite. Imperial Palace, throne of Veroxith, Coralie stood before the Emperor once more. The room was darker than before. Majesty, he said carefully, the doctrines are insufficient. I beg permission to... No deviation. Verox's voice cracked the chamber. Doctrine is perfection. Doctrine is divinity. Coralie bowed, humiliated. Then we will fail by your will. He returned to his quarters and scrolled through the oldest doctrines, the sealed ones. There, buried in forbidden archives, he found them. The Thronefall contingencies, protocols for total collapse. Contingency 0, lineage decapitation. Immediate withdrawal of all fleets. He stared at it long, fingers hovering, then closed the file. He was not yet desperate enough. Not yet. Derelict station, edge of Vega sector. A distress beacon. Carthian diplomats offering humanity retrovax to cure the Vega 2 plague. Derringer knew it was bait, but he couldn't ignore it. Empathy's our curse, he muttered to Sal before boarding a rust-streaked shuttle. Hours later, as his team docked with Derelict's decaying ring, lights flickered, too regular to be power failures. Then came the hiss of magnetic locks. The thud of boots. Derringer turned, pistol drawn, but it was too late. Imperial troopers flooded in, weapons leveled. At their center, calm and cold, stood Grand Marshal Corliss. "Mr. Derringer," he said, "your chaos ends today." The human smirked, bruised and cornered. "You sure you want to bet on that?" And the lights went out. The hum of the unquestionable mandate's engines was low and omnipresent, like the growl of a caged god. Robert Derringer drifted awake in its rhythm, chained upright to a cold steel pillar in command bridge. His head pounded. His wrists ached. The taste of blood and iron lingered in his mouth. He blinked against the harsh white light. The bridge around him gleamed with cruel perfection. Transparent floors, endless holographic projections, and rows of silent officers frozen in reverent fear. At the center, before the throne console of command, stood Grand Marshal Corliss, his face drawn tight, his eyes heavy with exhaustion, and above him, on a hovering projection of burning gold, Emperor Verox glowed like a sun. "Human," the Emperor said, voice rolling like tectonic thunder, "your chaos ends here. Your species' resistance, your glitch in the universe, will be erased." Derringer's gaze drifted across the bridge. His jacket was gone. His lighter and cigarettes lay on a console, dismissed as useless relics. He gave a humorless smile. "Funny," he rasped. "You talk like someone who's already scared of losing." Verox's crown flared brighter. "You misunderstand. You cannot lose to the divine. You can only cease." A ripple passed through the guards. One of them, a Draxorian, scaled, broad-shouldered, and visibly shaken, kept glancing toward the human. His hand trembled on his weapon. Derringer noticed. "Hey, big guy," Derringer said softly. "You ever wonder what happens when God bleeds?" The Draxorian froze. His second eyelids flicked, an instinctive tell of suppressed thought. Derringer's words were not just defiance. They were infection. The Emperor's voice boomed again, mocking. "Speak, monkey, before your last breath." Derringer tilted his head, eyes narrowing with lazy defiance. "Sure." He motioned slightly toward the console where his lighter and cigarettes lay. The Draxorian hesitated, then, almost unconsciously, grabbed them and placed one between Derringer's lips. The spark flared. Smoke curled upward, gray and slow. Derringer's grin widened. "You wanted order," he said, exhaling. "But the universe, it's been waiting for someone like me to flip your damn table." The Draxorian blinked, remembering the transmissions, the human footage, the symphonies, the words they die for each other. Verox leaned forward, incandescent with rage. "Kill him." But before the command could echo through the chamber, an explosion tore through the deck below. The entire bridge shook. Sirens wailed. Bulkheads sealed. Verox's image flickered, warping into static fury. "Report." Corliss shouted. "Mutiny," a voice screamed. "Draxorian units in the lower decks. They've turned their weapons on Ascended." Through the chaos, a transmission cut in, Harbinger's voice. "No more dying for your glory. We fight for our own now." The guards hesitated. The Draxorian, who had lit Derringer's cigarette, turned, leveling his rifle at his Ascended overseer. One shot, clean and decisive. The officer fell, and just like that, the chain reaction began. Below decks erupted into chaos. Draxorian soldiers tore through Ascended formations, battle hymns replaced by guttural war cries. Vassal races, long enslaved, saw opportunity. In hangar bays, engineers sabotaged power lines. On supply decks, alien laborers seized weapons once meant to oppress them. The Empire's perfect hierarchy shattered from the inside. On Ordinatus Prime, Scribe Foritis, Seven observed the catastrophe unfold through 1,000 bureaucratic lenses. To him, it appeared as numbers, reports piling up, requests rerouted, fleet stranded. He'd anticipated it, even encouraged it through subtle manipulations. "The great system correction," he whispered, tapping his spindly fingers on a terminal. He executed an innocuous command string, 39 characters long, that unleashed a bureaucratic apocalypse. Supply chains quarantined themselves. Fleet requisitions vanished into cross-reference disputes. Automated inspections flagged every ship for doctrinal contamination. Within hours, the Empire's vast war machine turned upon itself. not through battle, but through the very perfection of its process. And while Feritis watched the collapse unfold, his mandibles clicked in satisfaction. The system obeys perfectly, and thereby dies perfectly. Back aboard the unquestionable mandate, pandemonium ruled. The bridge trembled with every blast. Deringer's guard, now ally, smashed his restraints. They fought their way through smoke-choked corridors. Harbinger's mutineers surged upward, rifles glowing, scales dusted with ash. Deringer stayed close behind, half guide, half nuisance. "Auxiliary bridges too, decks up," he shouted over the din. "Path blocked," Harbinger growled, flattening a sealed door with one punch. "Now it's not." "Subtle," Deringer muttered, coughing through the smoke. They reached the upper deck amid chaos. Flames licking the ceiling, shattered consoles sparking like fireworks. At the far end stood Coralise, directing a cluster of loyalists, pistol in hand. He turned, meeting Deringer's eyes. For a brief, electric second, everything else vanished. Coralise was a warrior who had served order all his life. Deringer was a man who served none but truth. Coralise raised his weapon. "We could have ended you cleanly." Deringer didn't answer. He rushed past him to the communications terminal. "Marshal," Deringer said between keystrokes, "you built your empire on words. Let's see how fast it breaks under them." He accessed the Imperial command net. The display flashed with ancient glyphs. The High Command crisis tongue, a language few remembered. But Deringer did. Imperial broadcast override. Code. Thronefall, he spoke aloud, his voice carrying authority the system had long forgotten. "The Emperor has fallen. A traitor seizes the throne. Execute contingency 0. Disengage and regroup." Across the fleet, officers froze. The words carried doctrinal authority. To ignore them was heresy. Within minutes, Imperial ships began turning away, breaking formation, retreating blindly. Perfect soldiers, following perfect rules, undone by one imperfect human's lie. Coralise watched, expression hollow. You're not fighting us. You're fighting the idea of us." Deringer met his gaze. "Exactly." Coralise gave a slow, weary nod, understanding at last. He holstered his weapon, squared his shoulders, and faced the collapsing bridge, then let it end properly. He drew his sword and charged into chaos. When the fires finally dimmed, Harbinger and his surviving troops stormed the Emperor's sanctum aboard a sister ship. The great Veroxiv, God Emperor of 10,000 species, was found not in radiant light, but in the dim of emergency power, clutching a failing life support node. He looked smaller than Myth, old, trembling, furious. Harbinger stood before him, rifle steady. "You called us assets," he said. "Now you're inventory to history." He ordered the Emperor taken alive, for all vassals to see. The Empire fractured instantly. Fleets turned on one another. Vassal worlds declared independence. Civil war erupted like wildfire in a vacuum. Across the galaxy, new signals pulsed. Cheyenne scribes offered trade to humans. Draxorians seized their homeworlds. EV's broadcast flooded comms, not with propaganda, but with raw truth. Images of the Empire's cruelty, of cooperation born from rebellion. Humanity, bruised and scattered, became not conquerors but catalysts. On the ruined bridge of the Mandate, Deringer watched the stars shift as the retreating fleets blinked out one by one. Harbinger stood beside him, smoke curling from his armor vents. "You planned all this?" the Draxorian asked. Deringer shook his head. "No, I just gave everyone permission to stop pretending." They stood in silence, staring at the chaos they'd unleashed, chaos that had somehow, impossibly, restored balance. "They'll call it rebellion," Harbinger said. "Let them," Deringer replied. "We call it freedom." The stars beyond flickered, no longer a cage of empires, but an open frontier. The unquestionable mandate, once the symbol of imperial perfection, now drifted in silence, half its hull gutted, its banners burned away, its comms filled only with static prayers to gods that no longer answered. The war was over, though no one could say when exactly the end had come. Maybe it ended when the first Draxorian soldier refused to fire. Maybe it ended when Emperor Varrock screamed for obedience and no one obeyed. Or maybe, Derringer thought, it ended when a lie became truer than the Empire itself. The ascended Empire had fractured. Fleets splintered across the stars. Vassal worlds turned their weapons inward, purging old masters, reviving older grudges. The once harmonized machine now tore itself apart in synchronized collapse, an empire devouring its own perfection. And through the debris, the victors drifted quietly. Weeks later, a repurposed Draxorian cruiser, once the dread ship Executive Order, now bore a new name stenciled in raw gray paint across its flank. Unchained, inside its cavernous hangar, the scent of burned metal mingled with the fresh tang of paint. Banners hung from scaffolds, handmade, uneven, bearing the crude emblem of a broken chain. Derringer sat on a crate near the corner, watching it all unfold. Mechanics, freed workers, Draxorian soldiers, even a few Cheyenne scribes worked side by side, laughing, swearing, arguing. It wasn't orderly. It was alive. He rolled a battered pack of red deaths between his fingers, the last of them from Mars. Harbinger strode across the hangar, armor scraped and dull from battle, now marked by the same broken chain insignia. He looked different, lighter, no longer a weapon, but a leader learning how to be something else. "You're quiet, human," Harbinger said, his voice rumbling low as he approached. "The galaxy owes you its freedom. Tell me, what will your people do with it? Build your own empire from these ashes?" Derringer smiled faintly. "Nah." He pulled the final cigarette from the pack, lit it, and let the smoke curl lazily into the air. The ember glowed like a dying star between his fingers. "Too much paperwork," he said, then ground the cigarette out on the crate. Harbinger stared for a moment, then laughed, deep, unrestrained, shaking the hangar walls. It was a sound that hadn't been heard among his kind in generations. Others joined in, unsure why, only knowing it felt right. In that laughter echoed the absurdity of victory, the human kind of victory, the kind that didn't demand monuments or thrones, the kind that won by breaking rules and then refusing to replace them with new ones. Across the sector, the post-war galaxy began to take shape. The Cheyenne scribes reopened trade routes, swapping art for rations, poetry for plasma cores. The Draxorian clans reformed their councils, preaching strength through choice, not chains. The vassal worlds, long oppressed, sent transmissions in their own languages again, some songs, some manifestos, some laughter. And through it all, humanity kept to its small blue worlds and junkyard stations, content to watch from the sidelines. Their victory was measured not in conquest, but in the quiet comfort of not having to fight anymore. Foritas 7, once the most meticulous servant of imperial order, lived among refugees on Ordinatus now, teaching children arithmetic through broken bureaucratic code. They called him the scribe of errors. Evie, the AI that had flooded the galaxy with empathy disguised as propaganda, now transmitted lullabies across reclaimed channels. Her voice had become the closest thing to peace many species had ever known. And somewhere in all that, Derringer's myth began to grow, not as a conqueror or revolutionary, but as a man who ended an empire with a cigarette and a bluff. On the Unchained, as the crew finished painting the last banner, Harbinger joined Derringer again. They stood at the open hangar doors, the stars stretching infinite before them. Uncertain, wild, beautiful. "You could have ruled," Harbinger said quietly. "They would have followed you." "That's the problem," Derringer replied. "Somebody always would." Harbinger nodded slowly. "Then what will you do now?" Derringer shrugged. "Sleep. Maybe teach someone how to lie properly. Might come in handy for the next idiot empire." That earned another booming laugh. Above them, the stars shifted, unbound by imperial navigation beacons for the first time in millennia. Every point of light was a possibility, every silence a beginning. In retrospect, history would call it the Great Fracture. Scholars would argue about who won, who lost, and whether humanity's interference saved or doomed the galaxy. But those who lived it knew better. Victory wasn't in banners or borders. It was in small rebellions. The refusal to kneel, the choice to laugh when a god screamed. Derringer had taught them all one truth. Order is fragile. Freedom is messy. And chaos, when it's kind, can heal. He stood, stretching his stiff legs, the ache of long wars finally settling into something like peace. The hangar lights dimmed as the ship's engines hummed to life. Harbinger turned to crew. "Set course to the edge," he ordered. Derringer smirked. "Which edge?" "Whichever one scares them most." As the Unchained rose from the dock, its new banners fluttered in the artificial wind, broken chains, gray and rough, defiant against the stars. Derringer leaned against the railing, watching the lights fade. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like a soldier or a symbol, just a man who'd done enough. He whispered, almost to himself, "Let them have their empires. We've got stories." The ship vanished into the glittering dark, leaving behind only echoes of laughter, rebellion, and the thin smoke of a final cigarette curling into the void.